It was just a Tuesday. Just a bus stop on the corner of 5th and Alder, where the same people waited, at the same time, for the same ride. But that morning, one young man didn't step forward right away. He stood still, his hand hovering over the fare scanner, his eyes fixed on the driver's wrist. Why did he pause like that? What did he see that no one else noticed? There are stories that pass us every day, quietly, like a bus rolling by. Some are never told. But if your heart has ever stirred at a memory no one else remembered, stay with us, here at Legacy of Courage Stories. The doors hissed open with that familiar hydraulic sigh. A few shuffled on without a word, heads down, earbuds in, half awake. The young man near the back of the line moved slower. He was in uniform, freshly pressed, navy blue and clean-cut. Not yet hardened by service, but already carrying its weight in his shoulders. He stepped up, tapped his card. Beep. And then he didn't move. His boots stayed planted on the rubber mat. One hand at his side, the other still hovering near the scanner, like something had reached out and held him there. The driver, a weathered man in his 60s, didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His hand, resting casually on the wheel, bore a faded tattoo just above the wrist. Time had dulled the ink, but not its meaning. A trident, seal insignia, once sharp, now softened by years and silence. The young recruit looked up, not in surprise, but in recognition. No salute. No, thank you for your service. Just a quiet nod, like a candle lit for someone you never met but somehow knew. The engine hummed. The scanner beeped again behind him as more passengers filed in. But for a breath, just a breath, there was a stillness. He moved on, found a seat at the back. The old driver never looked back. But his fingers, they briefly closed around the wheel, just a little tighter. And the bus rolled forward, as it always had. Just another day. Just a bus driver. But something had already changed. The road curved gently past the bakery, where steam still clung to the windows. The same people stood outside, sipping coffee from paper cups, wrapped in scarves despite the mild air. Inside the bus, the heater clicked quietly, pushing out a soft warmth that fogged the lower corners of the windshield. Charles kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear lever like it always had. He didn't speak. He rarely did. Not out of rudeness, but because silence, for him, had long ago become more natural than small talk. At the second stop, an elderly woman with a shopping bag struggled to lift it up the step. Charles reached over, lowered the ramp, and nodded as she slowly made her way on board. She didn't thank him. She never did. But she always gave him a look, grateful, tired, familiar. And he gave her the same half-nod back, like clockwork. The young recruit from earlier, now seated toward the middle, watched this quiet exchange. He hadn't taken his eyes off Charles since boarding. Not in a way that demanded anything, just observing, as if trying to fit together a puzzle no one else saw was even there. The ride continued. Students got on, commuters got off. A teenager laughed too loudly into his phone. A man near the back sneezed into a tissue and muttered an apology to no one in particular. Charles kept driving, his posture upright but relaxed. He blinked slowly at red lights, as if measuring time by traffic signals instead of hours. He didn't glance in the mirror, didn't adjust the radio, didn't speak into the dispatcher mic. He just drove. Not with urgency. Not with boredom. With presence. Like someone who had learned, the hard way, that there's something sacred in simply doing a thing well, without asking for notice. Outside, the city passed by, quickly for most. But inside that bus, for the ones who looked closely enough, time had a different weight. The bus rolled through the edge of downtown, where the buildings got taller and the sidewalks busier. A few more riders stepped on, exchanging brief nods or nothing at all. Charles kept his focus forward, the rhythm of the route as steady as breath. The young recruit shifted in his seat. His fingers tapped once against the metal pole beside him, then stilled. He glanced toward the front, then out the window, as if weighing something silently. At the next stop, the last of the morning crowd stepped off. For a moment, the bus felt nearly empty. Just a handful of passengers scattered across the seats, each in their own world. The recruit stood, walked slowly forward, and stopped just behind the driver's chair. Charles didn't turn. He kept one hand on the wheel, waiting for the light. "Excuse me, sir," the recruit said, voice calm but careful. "I saw your tattoo earlier." Charles gave the faintest tilt of his head, but said nothing. "Was it a seal trident?" A long pause. Then, without looking away from the road, Charles answered quietly. "Used to be. Nothing more." The light turned green. The bus eased forward again. The recruit stayed there, standing, not quite sure if he should say more. But there was something in the tone of that reply, something final, like a closed book or a door gently shut. He nodded, even if it wasn't seen. "I'm shipping out next month," he added softly, more to the air than to Charles. "Bud/S starts in Coronado." Charles's eyes didn't flicker. But his hands tightened on the wheel, just slightly, then relaxed. "That's a hard path," he said. "You'll find out who you are. Or who you're not." The young man nodded again. A breath left him, quiet and unsure. Then he turned, walked back to his seat, and looked out the window as the city moved past, ordinary, unchanged. But the silence between them stayed. Not uncomfortable. Just, understood. The bus turned down a narrow street lined with chain-link fences and faded murals. Morning sun filtered through leafless trees, casting soft shadows that stretched across the sidewalk like old memories. Inside, the ride had settled into its rhythm again. People glanced at their phones, gazed out windows, or simply sat in the kind of silence that only public transportation seems to carry, shared, but not spoken. Charles kept both hands on the wheel. His expression unreadable. The young recruit, now back in his seat, looked out but wasn't watching anything in particular. Then, from 2 rows behind the driver, came a dry, rattling cough, sharp at first, then growing deeper, more erratic. Heads turned. A man in his 60s, pale and sweating, clutched at his chest. His breathing came short, strained, like he was trying to hide the panic behind it. No one moved right away. Charles did. He flicked the turn signal and guided the bus off its route, down a side street with no scheduled stops. No one said a word. There was no announcement. No question. He made a left. Then another. A hospital sign appeared up ahead, blue and white against the brick wall. The bus pulled smoothly to the curb. Charles stood, opened the door by hand, and stepped out. Within moments, a nurse pushing a wheelchair emerged from the emergency entrance. She looked surprised to see a city bus outside. Charles met her halfway. Said something short, quiet. Pointed. The nurse nodded and rushed on board. The man was helped down slowly, his cough fading into the cold air. He looked dazed, but grateful. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Charles got back in, shifted into gear, and turned the bus around like nothing unusual had happened. No one clapped. No one spoke. But the recruit watched him now, not with curiosity, but with something closer to reverence. There was no detour on the schedule. But some routes don't need to be written down to be the right ones. The midday lull settled in as the bus reached the end of its loop. Charles pulled into the layover zone behind the municipal building, a quiet stretch of asphalt with just enough shade to cool the dashboard. He shifted the bus into park and exhaled through his nose. A small sound, barely heard. Outside, a light breeze stirred leaves along the curb. The world kept moving, but this space felt still, held in a pause no one else noticed. The young recruit stood again. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was restlessness, maybe it was something else. He walked toward the front, slow and respectful. Charles didn't react. He remained seated, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, the other moving to unlatch the glove compartment beneath the control panel, more out of habit than need. It clicked open. And there, among route papers and a weathered clipboard, sat a neatly folded American flag. The blue corner showed first, white stars sharp against deep cloth. Next to it, an old metal badge, dulled with age. And beneath that, a worn piece of paper, folded once and barely held together by a piece of yellowed tape. The recruit caught sight of it. Not long. Just enough to recognize what it was. Charles didn't hide it. But he didn't offer an explanation either. He simply adjusted the papers, closed the compartment, and rested his hands on his knees. Neither man spoke. The recruit sat on the edge of the steps, not quite outside, not quite in. After a while, he said softly, "Was that from your unit?" Charles looked ahead, not meeting the question. "Just names," he said. "Ones I don't want to forget." The recruit nodded, "Once." His voice was quieter now. "I hope I earn mine." Charles didn't respond. But his hand moved, just briefly, pressing the glove compartment shut with a care that said everything. Some keepsakes don't need to be explained. They just need to be kept close. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting a softer light through the wide windshield. The layover was nearly up, but the bus still sat idle. Charles remained in his seat, steady and still, eyes forward as if he were watching a movie only he could see. The recruit stood just inside the front doors, his hand resting lightly on the pole near the steps. He hadn't meant to linger this long. But something in him wouldn't settle. He looked at Charles, really looked, and found himself caught between admiration and unease. There was a story here. Not just the kind written in history books or medals, but the kind that lives behind a person's eyes. And part of him didn't want to leave without knowing more. He took a breath. "Sir," he said, quiet and careful, "can I ask, did they ever thank you for what you did?" The question hung in the air like dust in sunlight. Not sharp. Not demanding. Just honest. Charles didn't move for a few seconds. Then he let out a breath, slow and measured, and looked toward the empty aisle. "That's not why we did it," he said. His voice was low, almost gentle. Not bitter. Not proud. Just true. The recruit nodded slowly, unsure what to say next. Words felt too small. He looked down at his boots, then back out the front window. I think sometimes people forget what came before them, he said. Charles let that settle. Then he replied, almost like it wasn't meant for anyone else to hear. We all forget. That's the problem. No anger. No regret. Just something heavier than either. The recruit didn't push further. He sat down on the front step, quiet again, his back to the dashboard. Charles remained still, hands loose on the wheel. They didn't need more words. Some silences carry more than a conversation ever could. And some questions don't need full answers. Just someone willing to sit with them a while. The bus made its final turn, the city thinning out into quiet blocks lined with modest homes and mailboxes leaning just a little. The stop at the end of the line was empty, as it usually was. No passengers waiting. Just the wind brushing through dry leaves on the pavement. Charles slowed the bus to a gentle halt. He reached for the lever, opened the doors with a practiced motion, and left them there, open, breathing in the last of the day. The young recruit stood. He didn't rush. He walked forward with the kind of silence that came not from hesitation, but respect. He paused at the front, one hand on the railing, and turned slightly toward Charles. There were no speeches. No questions left to ask. No need. He stood at attention, not sharp or dramatic, just steady, and gave a quiet, deliberate nod. It wasn't the kind of gesture that demanded acknowledgement. It was the kind that gave it. Charles didn't move at first. Then his fingers lifted from the wheel and came to rest gently on the edge of his sleeve, right where the faded tattoo lay beneath. No words. Just a moment between two men, one at the beginning, one long past the middle. Both understanding something that didn't need explaining. The recruit stepped off, boots landing soft on the curb. He didn't look back. Charles closed the door with a slow pull, shifted into gear, and began the return. No music played. No sound but the engine and the road ahead. But in that stillness, something had been said. And it was enough. The return route was quiet. Most of the morning riders were gone. Just a few scattered passengers now, an elderly man dozing near the window, a woman flipping through a worn paperback. The light outside had taken on that late afternoon gold, the kind that makes everything look softer, even the sidewalks. Charles drove without hurry. His hands steady, his gaze calm. The city drifted past like it always did, but there was something different in the air now. Not loud. Just settled. At one of the mid-route stops, a man stepped on, tapped his card, and took a seat without a word. The scanner gave its usual soft beep. Then another rider. Another beep. The rhythm was the same. But when the recruit had boarded that morning, there'd been a pause. A beat in the sound, a break in the motion. It hadn't been long. Just enough to be remembered. Charles reached for the fare scanner now, not to adjust anything, just to rest his hand near it. As if retracing a moment that hadn't made noise, but had left something behind. The bus rolled forward. Outside, a few schoolchildren waved from a sidewalk. One of them pointed, laughing, at something they saw through the window. Charles didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and just let it pass through him like everything else. At the next red light, the engine settled into idle again. And in that hush, between the hum and the turning green, was a memory. Not of war. Not of loss. But of a young man who paused. Who saw something faded. And nodded like it still mattered. Charles adjusted his grip on the wheel, not tighter, not looser. just enough to know he was still here. Still driving. Still remembered. Sometimes, the most powerful moments in life happen in silence, a small pause at the front of a bus, a folded flag kept out of sight, a quiet nod between generations. Through the quiet rhythm of an ordinary day, we watched a young recruit recognize something deeply human in an old bus driver named Charles. Not a story told out loud, not a title announced, just a faded tattoo, a quiet detour, and the kind of steady dignity that no longer seeks recognition. This story reminds us that valor isn't always loud. It often rides alongside us, unnoticed, until someone chooses to see it. What would change in our world if more people looked up and noticed? Maybe you know someone like Charles. Or maybe, one day, you'll be the one someone else remembers, because of a quiet moment that mattered. If this story moved you, if it stirred something quiet in your heart, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because these stories, of quiet strength, quiet service, and quiet honor, deserve to be remembered. Who are the quiet heroes in your life? We'd love to hear in the comments below.